Chapter 1. The Quilting Circle. The afternoon sun dappled the vicarage lawn, falling in gentle, warm patches over the white trestle tables laden with tea cakes, seed scones, and slices of Victoria sponge. Beyond them, under the shade of a spreading copper beech, the ladies of St. Mary Mead's quilting circle sat in a loose semicircle, their fingers busy with needle and thread, while their tongues, inevitably, worked just as quickly. It was, in theory, a charitable gathering, a quilt to be raffled at the harvest fair in aid of the church roof. But in truth, it was also a meeting of the village's unofficial news agency. Miss Hartnell was relating, with her usual relish, the saga of the butcher's boy and the missing sausages, while Mrs. Price Ridley contributed a running commentary about the vicar's sermon length last Sunday. At the far end, Mrs. Bantry stitched with quick, precise movements, occasionally leaning to confer in a low voice with the vicar's wife, her eyes darting toward the younger Mrs. Carruthers, who had only moved to the village last year and who, it was whispered, had a past more interesting than her tidy hair and modest frocks suggested. In the midst of it all sat Miss Jane Marple, white hair soft about her face, pale blue eyes downcast toward her own neat row of stitches. She said very little, save for the occasional murmured agreement or gentle inquiry. To anyone glancing over, she might have appeared mildly preoccupied with the evenness of her quilting, but those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle flick of her gaze when Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned an unexpected caller at the Carruthers on Tuesday evening, or the faint tightening of her lips when Miss Hartnell described seeing someone lurking near the post office after dark. It was Mrs. Sims, the housekeeper at the old rectory, who broke the gentle clatter of conversation with a small cry. "Oh!" she exclaimed, lifting a square of white cotton into the light. A vivid streak of crimson ran diagonally through it, catching the sun with a strangely fresh gleam. "Red thread, well, that's peculiar. This bit's meant to be plain white." Several ladies leaned forward to see. Mrs. Bantry peered at it with faint distaste. "Looks almost like blood," she said lightly, though her tone didn't quite carry conviction. "Oh, don't be morbid, Dolly," laughed Mrs. Price Ridley, though she herself edged back in her chair. Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on the scarlet streak. "It is an odd choice for the border," she murmured, her voice mild. Unless, of course, it wasn't a choice at all. She let her eyes travel across the faces around her, some curious, some amused, one or two faintly uneasy, before bending again to her own work. By the time the tea was poured and the plates of sandwiches diminished, the matter of the red thread had been swallowed by fresh gossip concerning the arrival of a stranger at the Green Man Inn. But later that evening, when the vicarage lawn was empty and the quilt squares packed away in Mrs. Bantry's basket, the streak of crimson remained vivid in more than one mind. And the following morning, when the body of Mrs. Carruthers was found in her parlor, her sewing basket overturned and her hands clutching at the folds of an unfinished quilt, those who had been present the day before would remember that peculiar square and how the conversation had faltered when it appeared. Miss Marple, for her part, simply looked thoughtful, as though she had been expecting all along that something in the neat, polite pattern of village life was about to be violently unstitched. Chapter 2. Whispered Stitches. News of Mrs. Carruthers's death moved through St. Mary Mead with the same stealth and persistence as a draught creeping under a door. Slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. By mid-morning, the postmistress had been told twice, each version slightly altered, and the customers in the high street shops spoke in careful voices as though the tragedy might be listening in from the next aisle. The Green Man's public bar was uncharacteristically subdued. Even old Mr. Cottrell, whose conversation usually turned on the unreliability of the bus service, was leaning forward to hear the details offered by the milkman, who claimed to have passed the Carruthers' cottage not an hour before the discovery. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching a loaf under one arm, stood close to Mrs. Bantry, as though proximity might grant her more authority in the telling. "Found in her parlour," she said with a delicate shudder, with that dreadful quilt under her hands. "And such a mess in the room, things knocked over, tea cold on the table. I do think she must have been surprised by someone she knew. She wasn't the sort to open the door to just anyone." Mrs. Bantry nodded gravely, but did not add to the theory, her eyes flicking toward the far end of the counter where Miss Marple, with her usual air of unhurried purpose, was selecting a tin of treacle. It was not lost on Mrs. Bantry that Miss Marple's ear, though seemingly devoted to her shopping, was tilted ever so slightly toward their conversation. The police had come from Much Benham, the nearest market town, in the form of Inspector Cray and a younger constable. They had closed the little parlour, the lace curtains drawn against curious eyes. Inspector Cray was a large man with a habit of smoothing his moustache before speaking, which he did now as he stood in the Carruthers' garden addressing a small knot of neighbours. "Nothing to be gained by speculation," he announced, which naturally ensured that speculation would redouble once he left. "We shall be speaking to everyone who knew the deceased. That will be all for now." In the churchyard, where a brisk wind scattered early leaves among the gravestones, Miss Hartnell relayed the news to Miss Weatherby, lowering her voice only when two young girls passed by. "It's bound to be that stranger at the inn," she said confidently. "A woman alone. A man she doesn't know. What else could it be? You mark my words." Miss Weatherby, who disliked having her words marked, allowed that it was possible, but her gaze wandered toward the lane leading to the vicarage. "Or someone from nearer home," she said. "People do forget that evil is not always imported. Sometimes it's brewed right here." Meanwhile, Miss Marple was in the vicarage garden, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her black currant jam for the harvest fair. The vicar's wife received her with pale cheeks and a quick clasp of the hands. "Oh, Jane, it's dreadful, absolutely dreadful. She was here only yesterday, sitting under the beech tree, and now—" Her voice trailed away, her eyes drawn to the church spire visible over the wall. "Such a pretty thing, that quilt. Dolly Bantry still has the rest of it at her house. They were saying it would be finished in time for the fair, but now, well, it feels almost indecent, doesn't it?" Miss Marple agreed softly, her gaze resting on a row of sunflowers nodding in the breeze. "Some objects do take on a different air after tragedy," she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "the red thread did catch my attention yesterday. So unusual, in a white square." The vicar's wife frowned. "Oh, yes, I'd quite forgotten about that. It must have been an accident, surely. Perhaps she dropped her needle in a reel she'd used before." Miss Marple merely inclined her head, but her eyes had the faint glimmer of someone who had just stored away a scrap of information in the quiet compartments of her mind. She left the vicarage soon after, her steps slow, as though she were admiring the tidy hedgerows. In truth, she was considering the quilt, the red thread, and the curious way Mrs. Carruthers had been found, as though she'd been interrupted not just in sewing, but in the act of arranging something quite deliberately. Across the village, Mrs. Bantry sat in her drawing-room with the basket of quilt pieces beside her. She had told herself she ought to keep them safe for the police, though Inspector Cray had shown no interest when she'd mentioned them. She lifted the red-threaded square now, frowning slightly. There was something odd about the way the crimson strand trailed at one edge, knotted hastily as though to hide a fray. She was still staring at it when the front bell rang sharply. It was Miss Hartnell, flushed from walking. "Have you heard?" she demanded without preamble. "The stranger at the Green Man. He's left, packed his bag and gone. First thing this morning. If that isn't suspicious, I don't know what is." Mrs. Bantry tutted. "People leave villages all the time, Hartnell. It doesn't mean they've murdered anyone, and besides, the police will have his name and direction." But as Miss Hartnell departed, her words lingered unpleasantly in the room. "Mrs. Bursa," Bantry found herself looking again at the red-threaded square, then out the window toward the quiet lane. By late afternoon, the village seemed to have divided into two distinct camps, those certain the stranger was guilty, and those who insisted the culprit must be someone long known to Mrs. Carruthers. In both camps, however, there was agreement on one point. Miss Marple must know more than she was saying. She had been there at the quilting circle, after all, and if she had noticed anything, it would be in that deceptively mild way of hers, the way that made people tell her more than they intended. As the light faded to evening, Miss Marple sat in her own parlour, knitting with calm precision. Outside, the lamplighter made his slow way along the high street. A clock chimed the quarter hour, and Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-air. She was thinking not of the stranger at the inn, nor even of the red thread, but of something Mrs. Carruthers had said the previous week. Something almost absurdly trivial, and yet now, in light of her sudden death, it seemed to Miss Marple that it might not have been trivial at all. She resumed her knitting, the soft click of the needles steady and unhurried. In St. Mary Mead, the business of living went on. Tea was poured, blinds were drawn, and in the quiet between footsteps, a murderer walked among them. Chapter 3. The First Tangled Threads. Inspector Cray was not a man given to long deliberations. By the next morning, he had established his working theory and was set on pursuing it with the stubborn efficiency of someone who preferred the shortest path between 2 points. To the relief of some villagers and the private disappointment of others, he called at the Green Man first, where the elusive stranger had been lodging. The landlord, Mr. Prowse, proved a talkative soul, eager to assure the inspector that his former guest had been quiet as a mouse and had paid his bill in full before catching the early train to Exeter. But Cray's moustache twitched with satisfaction when he heard that the man had spent the better part of Tuesday evening walking in the direction of the Carruthers' cottage. By the time this morsel of information reached the high street, it had been expanded to include sightings of the stranger peering through Mrs. Carruthers' parlour window and leaving muddy footprints on her garden path. The fact that neither detail had been confirmed seemed only to lend them more weight in the eyes of those who favoured a swift resolution. In the post office, Miss Hartnell all but declared the case solved, while Mrs. Price Ridley nodded with the knowing air of one who had suspected as much from the beginning. Miss Marple, however, remained quiet. She had been seen that morning carrying a basket of preserves to Mrs. Bantry, pausing only to remark upon the unusually early blooming of the Michaelmas daisies. No one noticed the way her eyes flicked over the hedges and garden gates along the lane, as though searching for something far more specific than flowers. When she reached the Bantry house, she accepted a seat in the drawing-room beside the basket of quilt squares, her hands resting lightly in her lap. "Dolly," she said gently, "do you recall whether Mrs. Carruthers was working on this particular square yesterday?" She indicated the piece with the red thread, now folded neatly atop the others. Mrs. Bantry frowned, her brow creasing in thought. No. She had it on her lap for a moment, but I don't think she stitched it. I remember because she kept smoothing it flat, almost as though she were hiding something in the fabric." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though she said nothing more on the matter. Instead, she inquired after Colonel Bantry's gout, allowing Mrs. Bantry to drift into a more comfortable topic. But when she rose to leave, she asked, almost idly, if she might borrow the red thread square for a day or two, to which Mrs. Bantry agreed without hesitation. At the same time, Inspector Cray had moved on to questioning the nearer neighbours of the Carruthers' cottage. Mrs. Weatherby, whose window overlooked the lane, reported seeing a figure outside the house on Wednesday evening, shortly after dusk. Unfortunately for Cray's purposes, she insisted the figure had been small and slight, wearing what appeared to be a woman's hat. This detail he received with polite skepticism, making a neat note in his book before directing the conversation back toward the stranger from the inn. In the church hall that afternoon, the quilting circle met again under a subdued air. The long tables, usually bright with chatter and colour, seemed muted, and the women's voices dropped whenever the door opened. Some were visibly uneasy. Others, like Mrs. Sims, appeared invigorated by the drama. "Mark my words, we'll have it all cleared up by the week's end," she announced to anyone within earshot. "The police are very thorough." Her confidence seemed to rest less on experience than on the hope that the ugliness of murder could be neatly contained and forgotten. Miss Marple sat at the far end, her needle moving with steady precision. Though she contributed nothing to the ongoing debate over the stranger's guilt, she did inquire, in the mildest tones, whether anyone had known Mrs. Carruthers before her arrival in St. Mary Mead. This prompted a few vague recollections of her late husband's business in Manchester and a brother somewhere abroad, but no one seemed to know more. The lack of detail seemed to interest Miss Marple more than the information itself. That evening, the village's attention was caught by a small but curious development. Constable Briggs, sent to fetch a list of Mrs. Carruthers's correspondence, was seen leaving the cottage with a slim sheaf of letters tied together by a narrow ribbon of red silk. The sight of the ribbon caused more than one raised eyebrow, for it was remarked upon at once in the public bar of the Green Man, where Mrs. Price Ridley, in for her evening tonic, pronounced it too much of a coincidence to ignore. Miss Marple heard of the ribbon later that night when Dolly Bantry telephoned her. "Jane, it's the same colour as the thread," Dolly whispered, as though speaking too loudly might carry her words to unfriendly ears. Miss Marple thanked her for the information, and asked, in the most unassuming tone, whether Dolly recalled where Mrs. Carruthers kept her sewing things when not at the quilting circle. Dolly hesitated, then admitted she had never noticed, a detail that seemed to please Miss Marple rather than trouble her. Before retiring, Miss Marple sat for a long time at her writing desk, the red thread square laid flat before her. She studied it closely in the lamplight, running her fingers lightly along the stitched edge. There was something there, something in the way the fabric was pulled, that would have gone entirely unnoticed by anyone who did not understand the tiny betrayals of a seam. When at last she put it away, she did so with the air of someone who had confirmed a suspicion, but who knew very well the importance of keeping such things to oneself. By the next morning, Inspector Cray's focus had narrowed almost entirely to the missing stranger. Notices were sent to stations in the surrounding counties, and it was whispered in the High Street that an arrest could be made any day now. But among those who had long known Miss Marple, there was an unspoken understanding that the inspector might be looking in the wrong direction. She, after all, had asked no questions about trains or timetables, only about sewing habits, the arrangement of parlours, and who, precisely, had been in the vicarage garden on Tuesday afternoon. In St. Mary Mead, life continued its outward rhythm. Milk deliveries, church bells, gossip at the shop counter, but beneath the neat veneer, something uneasy stirred. The threads of the case, visible to all in their tangled confusion, were not the ones Miss Marple was following. Hers were finer, hidden within the ordinary fabric of village life, waiting for the right moment to be drawn tight. Chapter 4. A stitch out of place. Inspector Cray, encouraged by the prospect of a telegram from Exeter, devoted his morning to confirming train times and composing stern notes about the stranger's movements. The village, for its part, nourished itself on this activity as if it were a second breakfast. Hushed clusters formed at thresholds, doors lingered half open, remarks were offered in gentle, moral tones, as though propriety could soften the shape of murder. Amid this circulation of certainties, Miss Marple walked with her customary small basket along the lane to the Carruthers' cottage, pausing to admire the tidy verge where feverfew and marigold competed in prim yellows. She rang once, lightly, and was admitted by Constable Briggs, who had learned that refusing Miss Marple was rather like refusing the clock. One might do it, but the day would not go well. The parlor retained its air of sudden interruption, a cushion on the carpet, a book overturned on the ottoman, a teacup set slightly aside from its saucer as if a hand had been startled mid-air. Miss Marple looked without looking, a habit she had cultivated in years of observing gardens and human nature. She noticed that a square of white fabric lay folded on the arm of the chair by the window. Without touching it, she saw the faint glint of a red filament emerging at one corner, a telltale whisker where a knot had failed. The sewing basket had been set on the floor, its contents ruffled rather than strewn. There is a difference, Miss Marple thought. One is temper, the other purpose. She asked, in a voice soft as dust, whether Inspector Cray might tolerate a minute or two of her foolishness. Cray arrived with his notebook and a politeness that concealed impatience. "I hope you haven't come to rearrange the furniture, Miss Marple," he said, moustache smoothed into civility. She smiled and replied that furniture had its own ideas, but stitches sometimes told truer tales. With a nod from the inspector, she took up the folded square. Her fingers found not the pulse of fabric, but a stiffer life beneath, something giving back a little, like paper under a bedsheet. She did not open the seam. That would be for the police, if they had the time and the inclination. Instead, she lifted the dangling red and held it near the window. It was not the fat domestic cotton favored by village shops. It was finer, flattened by weave, with a slight luster. Her eyes moved to the small sheaf of letters on the side table, tied with a red silk ribbon. "It is a pretty habit," Miss Marple murmured, "to tie one's letters. Some are content with rubber bands, which perish at the worst moments. Silk behaves better." Cray followed the direction of her gaze and gave a grunt that might have been agreement. He was not a man to be led by trifles, yet he marked, perhaps without meaning to, that the ribbon appeared a trifle shorter than such bundles required. Its bow was mean, its tails niggardly. "Lengthen it for me, would you, Briggs?" he said, and the constable retied the bundle, tugging with thick fingers. The knot would not do. Silk slipped, the tails barely met. A small thing, easy to put aside. Miss Marple did not put it aside. She asked whether Mrs. Carruthers had been particular about her sewing thread, and the constable answered for the room. "A tidy lady, miss, kept things just so." Miss Marple inclined her head, as though she had expected such tidiness. "Then it is odd," she said gently, "to find silk ribbon drawn and split to serve as thread. It passes in a pinch, of course, but it is not the choice of a comfortable needlewoman." She did not say more. She did not need to. The inspector's pencil hesitated, then moved. The notion of someone improvising, someone in haste, someone who did not habitually sew, entered the room and sat down among them like a quiet relative. On her way home, Miss Marple called at the vicarage with a jar of apple jelly, a gift so ordinary as to be invisible. The vicar's wife, who had spent a sleepless night between prayer and practicalities, looked grateful for a task and set about boiling water for tea. In the kitchen's comfort, Miss Marple mentioned, with innocent curiosity, that Mrs. Carruthers had once told her she disliked red on white, finding it harsh to the eye. The vicar's wife nodded, surprised to recall it herself. "She said it looked like a cut on a handkerchief," she murmured, and then, flustered, apologized for the macabre thought. Miss Marple accepted the apology as one accepts a draught of air, a necessary courtesy. She only observed that some aversions are anchored in experience, and experience, like soil, holds roots we do not always see. By afternoon, the quilting circle met again, an act of defiance against the disorder of death. The hall smelt of lavender polish and hot metal from the iron at the end of the table. Mrs. Sims, rattled and talkative, insisted on recounting how her aunt had once chased a thief with a hearth brush, which seemed to reassure her that the world had remedies. Dolly Bantry, pale but steady, produced more squares, while Miss Hartnell, in her martial way, asked whether anyone had been fool enough to lend the stranger a pair of scissors. Miss Marple, working a modest seam, allowed her attention to drift toward a remark from young Mrs. Finch, who helped with the mending at the old rectory. "I'd swear that red isn't sharp thread," Mrs. Finch said, half to herself. "It flattens in the needle's eye. Phrase queer. Like the ribbons we used to trim hymn books at Christmas." It was, to Miss Marple's way of thinking, as good as a bell rung softly behind a door. She pictured Tuesday's gathering on the vicarage lawn, the hymn book ribbons stored in a tin in the vestry after summer polishing, the vicar's wife bustling between tables, Mrs. Carruthers smoothing that white square again and again with a concentration not quite right for mere neatness. She remembered, too, the report of a small figure in a woman's hat near the cottage that evening, a detail Inspector Cray had delicately tolerated. People tend to judge by height and hat when they are uncertain of faces. People tend, also, to forget that hats can be borrowed and height disguised by posture. Miss Marple sewed her seam and said nothing of hats. She asked instead whether anyone had missed a ribbon from the vestry's tin. The question, phrased as a village housekeeping concern, stirred memory rather than alarm. The vicar's wife, fetched for the purpose, looked genuinely dismayed. "We had 3 lengths left from Christmas," she said, counting on her fingers as though the arithmetic might restore order. "I tied up the last of the Harvest Fair notices with 1 last week, and there ought to be 2 now. Oh, but there is only 1. She blinked, then coloured as if she had carelessly let a plate fall. Miss Marple murmured that ribbons have a way of straying to the nearest pretty parcel, and that it would be unkind to accuse anyone on so slender a basis. And yet, in the long quiet after, the absence of a ribbon lay on the table like a reflection without a face to own it. At dusk, Miss Marple sat by her parlour window and examined the borrowed square in the gentler light. Her fingertips read the seam the way a pianist reads keys in the dark, the irregular tension, the small lump where the red silk had doubled rather than knotted, the faint crispness beneath. She pressed softly along the edge and felt the give of insertion at a place where the weave puckered by a hair. It would be a small thing inside, very small, and it would be something one wanted hidden but close to hand. No time for cupboards or floorboards when alarm walks in with footfall. She did not open it. She wanted, quite deliberately, the act of discovery to belong to Inspector Cray. People accept more readily what they believe they have found themselves. The inspector came, summoned by a brief note in Miss Marple's careful hand that said only, "I think you will wish to see this square opened, if you would be so obliging." He arrived out of breath, prepared, perhaps, to be disappointed. Miss Marple, with a humility that fooled no one who knew her, offered him her sewing scissors and the chair by the lamp. He turned the seam with more delicacy than his size suggested, and out slipped a tidily folded slip of paper no larger than a grocer's tally. He unfolded it and stared, then stared again, as if the words might arrange themselves differently under a firmer gaze. After a moment he replaced the paper on the table as one sets down something hot. "It is interesting," he said, which meant in his language that its very existence unsettled his map of the case. Miss Marple inclined her head and poured him tea without comment. She did not ask what the paper said. She already knew it would not be the whole of anything, only a thread that contradicted certain tidy notions. It might be a direction, or a name with a line through it, or a small schedule of times that did not match Exeter. Whatever it was, it had enough of the secret about it to make a tidy woman sew it into a quilt square rather than leave it in a drawer. And it had enough of the village about it to have been written in a hand someone here would recognize, given the chance and the inclination. When the inspector left, more thoughtful than he had come, Miss Marple remained at the window watching the neat procession of lamplight along the street. Somewhere in the village a child laughed. A door closed firmly. A cat sprang with soundless purpose from one garden to the next. The ordinary, which had sustained St. Mary Mead through wars and winters, went on. But it seemed to Miss Marple that the quilt they were making, the visible one and the other, had begun to show its underside. Stitches seldom lie when turned to the light. The right person, confronted gently and at the proper angle, will fray at just the places silk will. And tomorrow, if Providence allowed, she meant to visit someone who spoke too confidently about ribbons and knew too little of sewing. Chapter 5. The Gentle Unravelling. Morning in St. Mary Mead was always a ceremony of sorts, milk bottles clinking faintly on doorsteps, the slow exchange of nods between neighbours, and the measured tolling of the church bell at the half-hour. Yet beneath this calm choreography, the murder of Mrs. Carruthers had turned the village's undercurrents brisk and cold. Inspector Cray, now in possession of the note from the Quilt Square, had not disclosed its contents, but his manner had shifted. Less fixed upon the vanished stranger, more attentive to certain faces closer to home. The village noticed, as it always did, though it spoke of the matter obliquely, as if discussing a change in the weather that might pass if politely ignored. Miss Marple took tea that morning with Dolly Bantry in the small breakfast room overlooking the garden, the window-framed roses whose blooms were beginning to soften and fall. Dolly's gaze lingered on them with the same uneasy fondness she had for the quilt squares resting in the next room. "It feels wrong to finish it now," Dolly admitted, fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, as if it belonged to her in some way, even the pieces she never touched. Miss Marple's reply was a gentle murmur about how work often outlives its worker and how the keeping of stitches can tell as much as their making. Her eyes, however, were far away, considering the small human habits that had gathered around Mrs. Carruthers in her last days. Habits that might have seemed harmless until seen in the right light. By late morning, Miss Marple was on her way to the old rectory, where Mrs. Finch was expected to be mending the vicar's cassock. Mrs. Finch was a sturdy young woman with a frank expression and an easy laugh, but she was also given to talking while she worked, which was precisely what Miss Marple intended. She arrived with a small tin of buttons, too pretty to be wasted, offering them as a gift for future repairs. Mrs. Finch, flattered, set them on the table and returned to her sewing, the steady bite of the needle through fabric punctuating her words. "It's been a muddle, this business," Mrs. Finch said, shaking her head. "Inspector was asking if I'd seen anyone about on Wednesday, but I keep telling him I'm always indoors at that hour. Still, you hear things. My cousin said she saw Mrs. Carruthers talking to someone by the churchyard gate last week, a lady, but not from here. Tallish, neat hat, the kind with the feather." She glanced up. "Not the sort of visitor you forget. Only my cousin said they looked, well, not exactly friendly." Miss Marple inclined her head as though the remark were merely of passing interest, but she asked, almost idly, whether Mrs. Finch recalled any talk of missing hymn-book ribbons. "Oh, those." Mrs. Finch's brow furrowed. "I took a few from the vestry tin for trimming the harvest fair boards. Thought the vicar's wife wouldn't mind. Had some left, but one went astray. Don't know where. Could have been anyone took it." She shrugged, returning her attention to the cassock. "Can't see why it matters." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She watched the younger woman's hands, noting the practiced economy of movement, the ease of threading a needle without looking. Then she said, with the faintest smile, "No, perhaps not. Yet I've found that the smallest borrowed thing sometimes tells the longest story." That afternoon, Inspector Cray stopped Miss Marple on the lane, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wary respect. "You've a way of pointing me at things without saying them," he said, smoothing his mustache. "That bit of ribbon in the quilt square. Do you know whose hand put it there?" Miss Marple's smile was the sort that could have been mistaken for modesty, though it was in fact a careful guard. "I couldn't say, Inspector. Not yet. But I think you might ask yourself who in the village can sew and who only pretends at it when there's need." The rest of the day seemed to drift under a fragile sunlight, yet the village air was charged, as if the cottages themselves were listening. Mrs. Price Ridley was seen leaning in close to Miss Hartnell outside the grocer's, their conversation hushed but animated. The vicar's wife moved about the high street with an expression of fixed composure, pausing at each shop window longer than necessary. And in the garden of the Green Man, the landlord was overheard telling a friend that, if the killer's still about, they're drinking tea with a lot of us. Miss Marple returned home in the early evening, the quiet of her parlour a welcome foil to the day's murmurs. She set her knitting aside and reached for the red thread square once more, though she had no need to examine it further. Instead, she sat with it in her lap, as if it were a piece of correspondence that would speak again if held long enough. The paper it had hidden was now in Inspector Cray's possession, but the knowledge it represented, what it meant to conceal and from whom, remained hers to fit into the pattern she was forming. She suspected the paper did not incriminate directly, but hinted, perhaps too neatly, at someone far away. Too neat, she thought, was rarely honest. As dusk settled, she looked out upon the lane, where shadows from the hedges lay in dark, uneven strips. Somewhere behind one of those hedges, or behind the calm veneer of a familiar parlour, was the person who had tied that ribbon and forced it into service as thread. They had done so quickly, with the clumsiness of necessity, but also with the hope that the smallness of the act would keep it from notice. They had not counted on someone who had made her life's work from noticing smallness. The next morning would bring her to the doorstep of a certain cottage, one where tea was always offered quickly, as though to occupy the guests' hands, and where sewing was spoken of more than it was done. But Miss Marple knew that a visit, to be useful, must appear perfectly natural. There was no surer way to loosen a tongue than to convince its owner they were quite safe. And so she folded the square away and let the evening close around her, a contented figure to any who might pass by the window, save for the keen glint in her eyes, which betrayed the truth that the quilt's most telling stitch was about to be unpicked. Chapter 6. Tea, Ribbon, and a Slip. Mrs. Price Ridley's cottage had the precise air of a room arranged to impress passers-by as much as guests. Chintz drawn a little too taut, ferns watered a little too recently, and a tray already laid out for a visitor who had not yet knocked. Miss Marple, who knocked all the same, was admitted with bustle and effusive shock at this dreadful business, and settled near a small table where a posy of late sweet peas looked valiantly bright. Tea appeared with unusual speed, as Miss Marple had known it would, together with the sort of wafer biscuits one buys for company but never eats oneself. She thanked her hostess with mild pleasure and allowed the pauses to lengthen, as if she were content to rest her bones and count the stitches in the antimacassar. "You have been such a comfort to the village, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley announced, distributing praise as one might distribute tracts, with an air of moral duty. "All this nonsense about ribbons and thread. The police are on the scent of that man from the inn, I'm sure. I was saying only yesterday, a decent woman does not borrow trouble." Miss Marple, pouring, murmured that trouble. "Like cats. Prefers to stroll indoors uninvited." She admired, with a little exclamation, a sewing cushion on the sideboard. Pink satin, its surface somewhat abraded, with pins thrust at odd angles into its heart. "So pretty," she said, turning her head as if to judge the cushion's best light. "You keep good company with your pins, dear." "Oh, that old thing," Mrs. Price Ridley said briskly, and then paused, correcting herself. "I mean, well, I do a little darning now and then. One must, but hems and that sort of thing are best left to those with patience." She lifted her cup with careful fingers. "Besides, my eyesight." Miss Marple's gaze drifted, apparently without intent, to the small scissors beside the cushion. They were bright, sharp-tipped, and unmistakably suited to paper rather than cloth. A ruffle of brown-edged paper clippings lay beneath them. Nearby, a thimble rested with a fine, even ring of dust inside. An industrious seamstress can be messy. Only the idea of one keeps a room this tidy. "I brought a little jar of quince jelly," Miss Marple said, after they had exchanged agreeable nothings about the harvest fair. "Only, silly of me, I came without string. Might I beg the loan of a length just to feel the jar is safe?" She set the jar on the tray with an apologetic smile. Mrs. Price Ridley rose, hesitated, and reached for a drawer that stuck at first, then opened. She rummaged among the proper things, twine, elastic, a folded paper bag, and produced at last a narrow length of red silk ribbon whose ends had been tightened hard enough to leave them sharp as tongues. "Will this do?" she asked, too casual. "You know how bits and bobs collect." Miss Marple accepted it with gratitude, the way one accepts a flower laid over a grave. "How pretty," she observed, keeping her tone as airy as a leaf. "We used something very like it at the vicarage last Christmas for the hymn books. Dear me, silk can be troublesome in a knot. It slips away from you unless you coax it." She tied slowly and let the knot hold just long enough to suggest that it might not. Mrs. Price Ridley laughed thinly and made a small correction with a forefinger, an efficient tug that did not belong to a hand unfamiliar with such material. Then, too late, she caught herself performing competence and arranged her mouth into a sigh. "I dare say anyone could manage that," she said. "It's only common sense." They spoke of the stranger from the Green Man with the soothing inevitability of people laying a familiar table. Mrs. Price Ridley, growing comfortable in the neatness of her own narrative, remarked that he had quite certainly taken the 8:12 to Exeter with a folded newspaper in his pocket and a travelling coat too good for a vagabond. "You saw him then?" Miss Marple asked, not quite looking up. The question fell like a soft shawl. One could sit under it or shrug it off. Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "Not I," she said quickly. "The landlord told someone who told me, and really, it's obvious enough. People like that always run." She topped the pot with water, though no one had asked for more tea, and the steam briefly misted her spectacles. "What puzzles me," Miss Marple mused, turning the jelly jar as if admiring the light through it, "is how very quickly poor Mrs. Carruthers seems to have been interrupted. The cup beside her chair, no lipstick, no crumb on the saucer. The sort of interruption that arrives from the garden gate rather than the front path, perhaps." "It is dear of you to keep your side gate oiled, Mrs. Price Ridley. One hears it seldom." The statement was bland enough to be harmless and just specific enough to be uncomfortable. Mrs. Price Ridley coloured a little. "My gardener attends to such things," she said. "I wouldn't know." Her ring tapped the tray, once, a tiny chime of nerves. They parted with the proper courtesies, Miss Marple departing with her ribboned jar and a memory of a forefinger that had tightened a silk knot by instinct rather than accident. She walked without haste to the lane, where Inspector Cray's broad back soon hove into view. He saluted her with his notebook. "Good timing," he said. "Telegram from Exeter. Our man did take the 8:12. He was traced to a modest lodging and has been found. Alibi uncertain, but—" He weighed the words and found them heavier than he liked. "But perhaps not quite the villain we ordered." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic, "Oh dear," and asked whether the paper from the quilt square had yielded a confession. "Not so obliging," he admitted, mouth wry. "A fragment, a time, an initial, a half-address. It sits askew with the rest." "In my experience," Miss Marple said, "when things sit askew, it is not always the fault of the chair." She did not suggest that a ribbon can do duty as thread only when scissors, of whatever sort, are near to hand, nor did she describe a thimble lined with dust. Instead, she mentioned, almost idly, that the vestry's tin of ribbon had not reproduced itself overnight, and that the vicar's wife, dear conscientious soul, was quite inclined to believe she had miscounted. Inspector Cray grunted something that might have been which, in his language, meant he had made a note and would deny it later. He asked, more carefully, whom Miss Marple considered unusually curious about the contents of a police telegram. "That is the pleasant thing about St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple replied. "Curiosity is universal, but the flavour of it varies. Some people attend to gossip as a gardener attends to weeds, by pulling at anything green. Others look only for nettles because nettles once stung them. She smiled, then added, as if reciting weather, that Mrs. Price Ridley had been kind enough to lend her a length of ribbon. Silk, you know. It does interesting things when tied in haste. He followed the glance she did not quite offer toward the jar. She did not hand it to him. One cannot snatch at subtleties. That evening the quilting circle convened again, their needles making a faint, companionable hiss. Dolly Bantry had laid out squares in a new arrangement, as though patterning could mend what murder had torn. Mrs. Sims fretted about the raffle. Miss Hartnell proposed, with martial zeal, that the quilt be auctioned to pay for a memorial bench. Young Mrs. Finch, head bent to her work, stitched with the quick security of someone who has done it daily since childhood. Miss Marple, her own needle unhurried, introduced a trifle of conversation about thread weights and the nuisance of silk slipping in the eye. She spread her thimble on the table with the absent-mindedness of age and watched how eyes moved and hands adjusted. Mrs. Price Ridley laughed a shade too brightly and said she could never be bothered. Her hand, reaching to straighten a square, paused a fraction when her fingers brushed a red tail. "Do you know," Dolly said suddenly, perhaps to dispel a hush she felt rather than heard, "I've mislaid my small paper scissors. Wretched things vanish precisely when one needs them." She looked about with comic despair. "Anyone?" There was the chorus of polite denial one expects, and then Mrs. Price Ridley, half rising, declared, "Mine are at home, I'm sure," in a voice that sounded more like a defense than an excuse. Young Mrs. Finch, eyes still on her needle, remarked lightly that paper scissors make ruin of silk and thread both, which is why she keeps them separate. A small, instructive silence followed, like a dropped pin. Miss Marple let the silence breathe and then, with the most artless tone, asked whether anyone had admired Mrs. Carruthers's hat at the last service, the neat little felt with the feather. "I thought it suited her very well for a woman who preferred not to be noticed," she said, inserting a stitch that lay perfectly flat. Several heads shook. Someone recalled she had left before the final hymn. The vicar's wife, trying to be helpful, wondered aloud whether such a hat had been borrowed from the jumble cupboard for the harvest fair. "I must look," she promised, earnest as ever. "We do lend things, you know, and sometimes they don't quite find their way back." Later, walking home in the blue pause before night, Miss Marple considered the way unease had circulated in that room, like a draught that cannot be found but keeps the flame troubled. She thought of the drawer that had stuck and then yielded ribbon, of a forefinger that corrected a knot too quickly, of a voice that knew a timetable by heart without claiming the sight of it. In the modest arithmetic she practiced, such sums did not yet make a name, but they moved the figure to a smaller circle. There are people who lie by arrangement, as one arranges flowers, and others who lie by reflex, the hand reaching out before the mind has chosen. It is the reflex that betrays. She set the quince jelly on her own dresser and, after a moment, untied the red silk ribbon. It bore a faint crease at a point not required by the jar's circumference, a memory of a tighter binding round something thinner, letters, perhaps, or the neat fold of a small paper that had needed taming. She smoothed it thoughtfully and placed it in an envelope marked only with the day's date. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Inspector Cray to accompany her on the smallest of errands, an errand to a cupboard where jumble hats sleep and ribbons once kept their count. With the right eye upon them and the right question spoken as if by accident, something or someone would pucker like a poorly managed seam. And when that happened, silk would not be the only thing that slipped. Chapter 7. The Cupboard and the Feather. The following morning dawned with a grey softness that dulled the edges of the village roofs and dampened the air with a faint mist. Miss Marple, looking out from her bedroom window, thought it an agreeable day for errands, particularly errands of the sort that benefited from a lack of bright sunlight. After a measured breakfast, she walked to the high street, stopping here and there for a word with neighbors, her small basket swinging lightly on her arm. She met Inspector Cray outside the post office, his mustache looking freshly brushed, his manner brisk but attentive. "I'm glad you're free this morning," Miss Marple said, with the mild tone of one requesting help with a tin too tight to open. "There's something in the vicarage cupboard that I think may interest you." "Oh, not in any alarming way, just one of those small matters that turn up in village housekeeping." She gave no further explanation, which was perhaps why Cray agreed at once. He had begun to recognize that her smallest errands tended to lead somewhere a good deal larger than advertised. The vicarage was calm under the mist, the garden damp with the scent of earth and fallen petals. The vicar's wife welcomed them with the graciousness of one determined to keep her home, a place of gentle order despite recent events. "The cupboard," she repeated, brows lifting. "Yes, of course. It's in the vestry. You know, Jane, I meant to check on those hats after you mentioned them the other evening." She led them down the narrow side passage, the boards creaking under their step, and unlocked the plain wooden door. Inside, the air had the faint scent of lavender sachets long faded. Shelves bore the jumble of fair donations, tea sets with mismatched saucers, stacks of hymn books tied with ribbon, boxes of gloves, and a row of hats resting neatly along the top. Miss Marple's eyes traveled gently from shelf to shelf. Her hands folded as though she were admiring the arrangement for its tidiness. Cray, meanwhile, stood back, his bulk almost filling the narrow space. "There," Miss Marple said softly, pointing to a small felt hat with a narrow brim and a single, modest feather. "That one is familiar, don't you think? I could swear I saw it on Mrs. Carruthers not a fortnight ago." The vicar's wife nodded. "Yes, she borrowed it for the harvest fair. Her own had got rained on. I had thought she returned it." She reached for the hat, turning it in her hands. Inside, the lining was faintly creased, as though worn more than once. It was Cray who noticed the faint smear along the inner band, a thread of red no thicker than a hair. He held it to the light. "Ribbon?" he asked, looking at Miss Marple. She smiled, but did not answer at once. "Possibly," she said at last, "or possibly only the ghost of one." She moved her gaze to the hymn books stacked beside them. 2 were tied with the same narrow red silk, neat bows fastened at the side. The third, however, bore a different fastening altogether. Twine, looped twice round and knotted in haste. "Oh dear," murmured the vicar's wife, her brow puckering. "That third one had silk like the others, I'm sure of it. I tied them myself last Christmas." She looked from the twine to Miss Marple, troubled now by the recollection. "I remember because one bow was very short. I'd had to make do." Cray's eyes narrowed slightly. "And that short bow, was it before or after Mrs. Carruthers borrowed the hat?" She hesitated, then said slowly, "After, I think. Yes, after." Miss Marple did not press the point. Instead, she lifted the hymn book with the twine and studied it as though it might tell its own story. "I suppose silk is prettier, but it will not serve in every case," she remarked. "Still, it's curious that it should disappear from one thing and reappear in another, particularly when the second use is so very makeshift." She replaced the book and asked the vicar's wife whether many villagers had access to the vestry cupboard. "Oh, anyone helping with the fair, really," came the reply. "It's always been open to them. Trust is a great comfort in a small place." As they left the cupboard, the vicar's wife was called away by the sound of the telephone. Miss Marple and Cray stepped into the cool air of the churchyard. "You've a thought forming," Cray said, glancing at her sideways. "I can see it." She smiled faintly. "Only that habits betray themselves. Borrowing is nothing, Inspector. It's the haste that matters. A tidy woman makes a tidy theft. A hasty one leaves frayed ends. They walked slowly back toward the high street, where the quilting circle would be gathering later in the afternoon. Miss Marple intended to be there, though not for the stitching. There were certain reactions she meant to watch for, and certain small remarks she would place like pins in a paper pattern, just to see who pricked a finger. She suspected that the hat, the missing ribbon, and the red thread square in the quilt all pointed to the same pair of hands. Hands not accustomed to sewing, but driven to it by circumstance. When she arrived at the hall later, the long tables were already set with fabric and cups of tea. Dolly Bantry waved her over, and Mrs. Sims was recounting for the third time her theory about a burglar surprised in the act. Mrs. Price Ridley sat further down, her manner composed, her work, if it could be called that, resting idle in her lap. Miss Marple took a seat with a clear view of her and began threading a needle with deliberate slowness. It was Dolly who brought up the hats, her voice bright with the intention of light conversation. The vicar's cupboard is full of them, one with a feather just like the one Mrs. Carruthers wore. The remark drifted down the table like a leaf on water. Most smiled politely, but Mrs. Price Ridley glanced up too quickly, then back to her lap. Miss Marple noticed the tiny stiffening of her fingers before she resumed smoothing her square of fabric, which remained stubbornly unsewn. Miss Marple made no comment. She simply offered to pour tea for Mrs. Price Ridley, leaning across in such a way that the edge of her basket brushed the woman's arm. The movement drew a faint rustle, paper, perhaps, hidden within the folds of fabric. Miss Marple set down the teapot with a smile, as though nothing at all had happened. The conversation moved on, but the air between them felt fractionally thinner, as if a draught had passed. That evening, as the village lamps began to glow in the mist, Miss Marple sat by her own fire and reviewed the day's errands. The hat, the missing ribbon, the red thread square, they were no longer loose threads but stitches crossing in the same pattern. All that remained was to find the moment, the place, where the pattern could be turned over and the messy underside revealed. And when it was, she knew, the neat little picture on top would never be seen in quite the same way again. Chapter 8. Pins in the pattern. By the next afternoon the mist had lifted, leaving a pale wash of sun over St. Mary Mead, the sort that makes hedgerows look polite and cottages seem to lean a fraction nearer one another. Miss Marple, who liked days that put people at their ease, arranged to arrive at the church hall a little earlier than usual. She carried her basket, of course, and an extra work bag borrowed from Dolly Bantry that jingled faintly when set down. Inside lay nothing dramatic: spools, scraps, an old thimble with a dent, but it also held a narrow length of red silk ribbon folded upon itself like a small secret. Inspector Cray had been persuaded, with an air of humouring an elderly lady, to wander in later on, which Miss Marple understood to mean he would be nearby and listening through doors where possible. The hall had its customary brightness, the windows clean to within an inch of a fence, the teapot steaming on the end table, but the voices within were pitched lower than on merrier days. Dolly greeted Miss Marple with visible relief and an anxious flourish at the set of squares laid out to consider arrangement. Mrs. Sims announced that she had found her aunt's memorial bench subscription list from 1912, which she insisted might prove instructive. Young Mrs. Finch stitched with the quick, unshowy competence of someone whose hands remembered hard winters. And Mrs. Price Ridley sat with a placid smile that did not travel as far as her eyes, her work, two tidy seams begun and unadvanced, resting in her lap, like an alibi too neat to be entirely believed. Miss Marple began with nothing more accusatory than enthusiasm. "Dolly, dear, the raffle committee wrote to ask whether we might initial the back of each square for provenance," she said, producing a pincushion as if to sanctify the notion. "Just our first letters in red. A charming idea. Now, the difficulty is that the shop has only a very fine cotton in that shade, and we have, as you see, Only this slippery ribbon one could, at a pinch, split for thread. Which is better, do you think? She placed both upon the table with artless fairness, the proper red cotton, and beside it the narrow silk, ends pressed keen and thin. There is a particular silence that attends domestic choices, masquerading as trifles. It invites women to display their competence without boasting. Mrs. Sims took the cotton with relief and declared it perfect for initials. Dolly, apologizing for her eyes, asked Mrs. Finch to split her length for her. Mrs. Finch smiled and did so with practiced ease, teasing the ribbon apart along the grain and twisting a neat filament that would sit obediently in a needle's eye. "It will do, though it won't behave," she said, slipping it through the metal with the swift pinch and lift of habit. A few seats down, Mrs. Price Ridley took a piece in her turn, hesitated a beat too long, then brought the end to her lips and flattened it, pressing it sharply between forefinger and thumb. Her correction, quick, efficient, unthinking, produced a neat, hard point that made the ribbon submit. She looked up, saw Miss Marple watching the room generally, and smiled again, too carefully this time. The first initials sprouted politely on the backs of squares, DB, JM, HS, appearing like a line of small signatures along a far margin. Conversation warmed around them, and Miss Marple let it, asking about preserves and weather, drawing talk toward the vestry cupboard without quite touching it. Dolly, eager to be useful, wondered aloud if the little felt hat would be needed for fair dressing after all. "It's the prettiest thing," she said, "and just the right size for the church notice board mannequin." Mrs. Price Ridley, who was not sewing so much as conducting the idea of sewing with her fingertips, remarked that hats were troublesome in damp weather and ought to be kept in drawers, which was the sort of remark that signals knowledge disguised as advice. Miss Marple murmured something agreeable and looked serendipitously into her work bag. "Oh, how careless of me," she said mildly. "I've mislaid my small paper scissors, Dolly. Would one of you ladies lend me a pair for the notices?" The inspector, dear man, asked for tidier slips. She offered the statement to the room with the innocence of a passer-by feeding ducks. Across the table, 3 women produced scissors with cheerful speed. Mrs. Finch's were stout and nicked, good honest tools. Mrs. Sims offered kitchen shears with an apology, and Mrs. Price Ridley, after a beat of dainty confusion, declared she had left hers at home and folded her hands as if to prevent their volunteering further. It was then that the door opened on a draught, and Inspector Cray appeared, feigning embarrassment at intruding on important work. He was all bluster and compliments. How brave they were, how pretty the quilt would be, yet his mustache telegraphed concentration to anyone who knew how to read it. "I won't keep you," he said, "only a word." He let his gaze rest, with the politeness of a schoolmaster addressing a class, on the initials in red. A fine touch, that. Silk makes a slippery friend, though. He picked up a tail, tested it between finger and thumb, and, doing nothing more than any man might, observed, "Funny thing, how these ends sometimes show a crease as if they've lived another life round something narrower." The remark floated like thistledown, landing where it would. Dolly looked puzzled. Mrs. Sims pronounced it typical of ribbon. Mrs. Finch nodded and did not look up. Mrs. Price Ridley's hands stilled for a heartbeat, then began again, smoothing a square that did not want smoothing. "I'm sure silks have many lives," she said with a small, bright laugh. "They stray into letters, and letters stray into hands not meant for them." The phrasing, elegant, not quite village, made 2 heads turn. Miss Marple, who had been offering Cray a biscuit, kept her eyes down and said nothing at all. It was a relief when the vicar's wife hurried in, apologetic and flustered, asking if anyone had seen the key to the vestry cupboard. It had been on its hook after morning prayers. She was sure of it, and now the hook was empty. The little stir this created felt wholesome. People will always prefer lost keys to found motives. Cray, with an amiable suggestion that doors do sometimes keep their own counsel, offered to look. Miss Marple, very quietly, asked whether anyone had needed the cupboard since the previous afternoon. Hats, hymn books, anything at all. The vicar's wife, cheeks colouring with conscientious self-reproach, said she had not. She had been at the post office, and then on the telephone, and then, she faltered, there had been a caller, just after 4, to inquire whether the fair would need extra programme sheets. She could not at once remember if she had left the passage door unlatched while fetching the sample. The quilting resumed, a little jerkily. Miss Marple sewed a discreet J on the back of a square, and when no one seemed to watch, pricked the ribbon so that the tip left the faintest spot on her finger. She dabbed it with her handkerchief and chided herself for clumsiness. People notice blood the way cats notice bird song. "Silly of me," she said, smiling faintly, and accepted the sympathetic twitter that followed. She had wanted the ribbon to leave a memory in the room, the simplest kind, a colour linked to a sensation. Later, when someone thought of red thread as no more than an oddity in white, they might also think of a sting, and then of haste, and then of hands that had to make do. Just as the kettle boiled again, a small commotion gathered at the doorway. The landlord of the Green Man, hat in hand, apologizing for the interruption. He had brought a message from the station. Inspector Cray was wanted for a call. The stranger, it seemed, had been firmly accounted for at the relevant hour, a tiresome alibi involving a commercial traveller and a chess club. Cray excused himself with a face that kept its disappointment close. Yet even this tidiness had a burr. As he left, he said to Miss Marple under the scrape of chair legs, "That paper from the square? It's a partial address, Rose C. 4 p.m., gate." Vague as a weather vane. She inclined her head, and her eyes drifted to the women along the table, any one of whom might have an acquaintance named Rose, or a garden with a side gate, or a habit of meeting at 4 when curtains thin and kettles call. When the hall had settled again, Miss Marple set about a small domestic theatre. She drew from her bag a handful of church notices, untidy, overlong, and asked, with apologies, whether someone might cut them neatly for the board, my eyesight being what it is. Mrs. Sims, eager, used the kitchen shears and made an ugly chew of the edges. Mrs. Finch, apologizing for being fussy, squared hers with stout scissors into tidy slips, and Mrs. Price Ridley, after a charming insistence that she could not possibly be of use, reached instinctively for the nearest pair and drew the blades along the silk tail of ribbon that had strayed across the table, flattening it at the last instant with that same decisive forefinger. The snip was as quiet as a breath. She looked down, saw what she had trimmed, and made a tiny, vexed sound that did not match her smile. No one exclaimed. There was nothing to see but a shortened ribbon and a neat pile of notices. But in the small arithmetic Miss Marple kept, that reflex, the neat, thoughtless tidying of an inconvenient tale, added to the drawer that had stuck on request, to the forefinger that knew silk's obedience, to a voice that had spoken of letters straying into unwelcome hands. She rose soon after with Dolly. The afternoon declared a success, the initials admired, the kettle left to steam quietly. Outside, the light had softened again. On the path, Miss Marple fell in beside Inspector Cray, who had returned with a look of someone asked to move a fence post that would not budge. "A stranger is a model of dullness," he said. "No feather, no ribbon, no gate." Miss Marple, whose gaze had drifted to the churchyard wall, said that dull men were a comfort on dark nights, and then, after a moment, added, "You may find, Inspector, that Rose C. is not a Christian name at all. There is a Rose Cottage at the end of Pond Lane, with a side gate that sticks unless one has the habit of oil." Cray turned sharply. She continued in the same mild tone. "And as to 4 o'clock, tea-pouring hands are sometimes too occupied to watch another pair fetch a hat from a shelf." They parted with no more than that. In her parlour, Miss Marple laid the trimmed ribbon beside the dented thimble and the borrowed square's empty envelope. The pattern, turned over, had begun to show its knots. Somewhere in the village, a person who preferred neatness had been obliged to make a mess and had then tidied too well. Tomorrow, she thought, would do for Rose Cottage: a cupboard, a hat, and a gate that either sticks or does not. Such ordinary things. Yet it is always the ordinary that gives way when pressed at the right seam. Chapter 9. Rose Cottage. The next morning carried a briskness that made the hedges gleam with dew and lent the air a faint metallic tang. Miss Marple left her house at an hour that made it appear she was only off to the grocer's, her basket light in her hand. But instead of turning toward the high street, she took the narrower path that slipped behind the churchyard and followed it until the roofline of Rose Cottage appeared. A modest slate-tiled dwelling with whitewashed walls and a garden too carefully tended to be merely ornamental. The roses, even in the tail end of the season, were pruned with precision. The gravel on the path had been recently raked. She paused at the side gate. It was painted green and hung slightly askew, the hinges faintly shiny with oil. Miss Marple laid her palm against it and pushed. It swung open without complaint. Far too smoothly for something the vicar's wife had once remarked, always sticks in damp weather. The observation was tucked away as she walked the short path to the front door, where she was greeted after a moment by Mrs. Price Ridley, her expression set in the cordial blankness of someone caught between surprise and calculation. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant shock. You must come in. Do." The invitation was given with warmth, but there was a quick flicker in the woman's eyes, as if her mind had leapt to what, if anything, lay out of place in her parlour. Miss Marple accepted graciously, remarking on the roses, and allowed herself to be shown into the front room. It was immaculate, though in a way that suggested recent and purposeful tidying. The sewing cushion was on its usual side table, pins arranged like soldiers. "I was passing," Miss Marple explained, settling herself into a chair, "and thought I might see if you had any more of that red ribbon you so kindly lent me the other day. The committee has decided to finish the initials before the fair." She set her basket beside her, glancing with idle interest toward the small escritoire in the corner. A folded hat, black felt, no feather, rested on its top. Mrs. Price Ridley's smile was fixed. "I've hardly a scrap left, I'm afraid. These things do get used up." She busied herself at a drawer, producing instead a length of blue bias tape, which she offered with an apologetic shrug. Miss Marple accepted it without fuss, as though she hadn't expected otherwise, and let the conversation wander toward the harvest fair, the church flowers, and the weather's effects on one's rheumatism. After a quarter of an hour, she rose, thanking her hostess and remarking, "Such a blessing to have a gate that opens easily. Mine's a horror in this damp." The words were tossed out like crumbs for birds. Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes flicked up sharply before she said, "Yes, my gardener sees to it," in a tone that aimed for dismissal but landed nearer to defense. Miss Marple took her leave and walked the longer way back, allowing herself time to consider the polished hinges, the ribbon, and the curious absence of the felt hat with the feather, the one from the vicar's cupboard. Despite the fact that Mrs. Price Ridley had been one of the few to mention its existence before. She stopped by the vicarage to pass the time of day and, in the course of their chat, happened to ask whether the cupboard had yet yielded its key. The vicar's wife shook her head regretfully. "It's the oddest thing. And you know, Jane, the hat with the feather is gone altogether. I do hope it turns up. Such a sweet little thing." Later that afternoon, Inspector Craig called at Miss Marple's, his manner both brisk and faintly weary. "I went to Rose Cottage," he said without preamble. "She was all civility. Let me see her sewing things even. Nothing odd." Miss Marple, busy with her knitting, said mildly, "Did you open the sewing cushion?" He frowned. "It's for pins. What should it?" She looked up at him over her spectacles. Pins are useful, Inspector, but so are small hollows beneath the stuffing. They keep secrets nicely. Too small for letters, perhaps, but not for the right kind of paper. Cray's mustache bristled as he caught her meaning. And you think— I think, she said gently, that it would be interesting to know whether the paper from the quilt square and whatever might be in that cushion share the same hand. And I think one mustn't expect anything to be found lying out for inspection when one has been announced at the garden gate. By the time the quilting circle met that evening, the air in the hall carried a tautness beneath the steam of the kettle and the faint scent of lavender polish. Miss Marple took her usual place, speaking of ordinary matters, her hands steady on her work. She watched Mrs. Price Ridley arrive, her smile composed, her hands empty save for a square of fabric folded too neatly. There was no sewing basket in sight. Conversation wandered amiably until Dolly Bantry mentioned in her offhand way that the stranger from the inn had been cleared entirely. The effect was subtle but noticeable. A few women expressed relief, others regret at losing a neat culprit, but Mrs. Price Ridley only smiled a little too brightly and said, "Well, that will put all our minds at rest." Miss Marple's gaze remained on her stitches, but in her mind the words did not ring true. Rest, after all, is rarely what follows when the easy answer has been taken away. On the walk home, Miss Marple considered the pattern once more, the side gate that no longer stuck, the missing feathered hat, the red ribbon cut and recut, the sewing done not by habit but by necessity, and the note in the quilt square, cryptic but enough to call someone to a meeting they could not afford to have witnessed. These were not separate scraps of cloth. They were pieces of the same block, and she had only to arrange them so the image appeared. In the morning, she decided, she would invite Mrs. Price Ridley for tea. Not here, but at Dolly Bantry's, where the quilt could be laid out and admired, and where a certain red-threaded square could be placed directly under her hands. People, Miss Marple thought, often betray themselves when asked to handle the very thing they believed they had hidden. Chapter 10. The Last Stitch. It was a bright, sharp morning when Dolly Bantry laid out the quilt in her drawing-room, its squares forming a patchwork of the village's handiwork, and, in one case, its misdeeds. Miss Marple had been deliberate in her invitation list, keeping it small. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived in a well-pressed coat, her expression brisk, as though she had only spared the time as a kindness. The vicar's wife came too, eager to admire the work, and Inspector Cray sat unobtrusively in a corner, pretending interest in Dolly's chrysanthemums. The tea was served first, with warm scones and Dolly's best china, and the conversation flowed as easily as the milk from the jug. Miss Marple, in her mild way, began to speak of the quilt's journey, how each square told its own little story. She lifted one embroidered with neat blue forget-me-nots, another with a cheerful patch of gingham, and finally placed before Mrs. Price Ridley the square sewn with the infamous red thread. "This one," Miss Marple said softly, "has always struck me as unusual. The red silk, slippery stuff, far less useful than proper cotton. And it's split, you see, not bought as thread at all. A curious choice for a tidy woman like Mrs. Carruthers." She looked up, her eyes gently inquiring. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a small shrug. "I shouldn't think it means anything at all. People make do with what's to hand." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when there's no time to fetch better. When one needs to hide something very quickly, for instance, a slip of paper with a meeting place and time, perhaps. Paper like the one found in this very square, sewn in with red silk that once tied a bundle of letters in Mrs. Carruthers's possession." The silence in the room sharpened. Dolly's hand paused over the teapot. The vicar's wife looked from one woman to the other, frowning faintly. Miss Marple's voice remained low and almost conversational. The paper arranged a meeting at Rose Cottage's side gate, at 4 o'clock, when Mrs. Carruthers's tea was poured but not yet drunk. A gate that, until very recently, was known to stick, unless one oiled it. Mrs. Price Ridley's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the quilt. "You have quite a fancy for stories, Miss Marple," she said, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I dare say," Miss Marple replied. "But in this case, it's not fancy. You see, silk ribbon is awkward in a needle unless you've worked with it before, and when I borrowed that length from you, you handled it very easily indeed, flattening and pointing it without thought. Just as you did when sewing it into the square in a hurry, never imagining anyone would notice the difference. But I have always found that people's hands betray them. Your reflex with the ribbon, your reluctance to lend scissors at the hall, your too careful talk of that hat with the feather, the one Mrs. Carruthers borrowed from the vestry, and which has now vanished from the cupboard. I believe you wore it to that meeting so that a passing glance from the churchyard would think you were her, or she you." Inspector Cray shifted, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Price Ridley. Miss Marple continued, her tone still that of a kindly neighbour discussing the parish fete. "Whatever passed at that gate was not pleasant. Perhaps it was about the letters tied with the same red ribbon, perhaps a debt, perhaps a threat she made to you. But you left her alive, and then returned later to ensure she would not repeat the threat. That second visit left her cup untouched, her sewing basket overturned. And because you had to conceal that paper quickly, you took the nearest square and stitched it in, knowing it would be carried off with the rest. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Price Ridley gave a small, flat laugh. "You have no proof," she said, though her voice was thinner than before. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "The proof is in the small things, in the paper's hand, which matches a note you sent to the raffle committee, in the feather from the hat, found yesterday in your sewing cushion, tucked beneath the stuffing, and in the oil on your gate hinges, fresh enough to glisten in the morning light." She glanced at Cray. "I believe, Inspector, you will find the rest in her escritoire." Cray rose, his moustache bristling in grim satisfaction. Mrs. Price Ridley sat very still, her eyes on the quilt square before her, as though she could will the red thread to vanish. When she was led away, the room remained quiet for a moment, broken only by Dolly's sigh. "It's dreadful, Jane," she said softly, "to think all that over a bit of ribbon." Miss Marple smoothed the edge of the quilt. "Not the ribbon, dear. Never the ribbon. It's always the same. Pride, resentment, fear. The ribbon is only the seam that holds it together. And in time, seams give way." Outside, the village resumed its quiet rhythm. The kettle steamed. The church bell marked the hour, and in Dolly Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple folded the quilt carefully, as though returning it to its rightful pattern now that the stray thread had been pulled.